Bell has been rung. All right, thank you. Good afternoon. It's just the stalwart, we're at the home stretch, so just the committed are still here. I appreciate it. And just a quick shout out to ChatGPT for making the title of my presentation much more interesting than probably what the contents thereof are. But I will endeavor to satisfy the expectations of our robot overlords. So with that, we will dive right in. My name is Blake Bingham. I am the Deputy State Engineer from the Utah Division of Water Rights. I'm one of those deputies that was hired as a result of some funding that was passed a couple years back. I supervise all the regions within the Great Salt Lake for the Utah Division of Water Rights. And I've been asked to talk about wastewater reuse and the state engineer's role in evaluating that in the Great Salt Lake Basin. So we'll get underway. Of course, no good presentation is complete without a quote from Clausewitz. So this is one I've adapted. It says, "Everything in water rights is very simple, but the simplest thing is difficult." That stands true with wastewater reuse as it does with war, as Clausewitz originally quoted. And then from economist Stephen Landsberg, "People respond to incentives, the rest is commentary." And I think that is very illustrative of the Great Salt Lake Basin, as we will find out. And you'll see the slide that I'm talking about here shortly. It will jump right out at you when I talk about incentives or maybe perverse incentives, as you may see here. So I always like to start off with talking about historical context. For those of you who have seen any of my presentations, I think historical context is super important and interesting when it comes to water rights because it's helped shape the kind of the environment of water rights throughout Utah, how it's evolved along with our culture. So I thought I would do a little bit digging into our archives at the State Engineer's Office. Of course, as Teresa's mentioned, we've been around since 1897. We have a lot of historical documents. I couldn't find a whole lot, but what I found was pretty interesting. So the first thing to note, wastewater reuse, beginning from when we started the water rights application process in 1903 all the way up to about 1994, there really wasn't any statutory or legal precedent for wastewater reuse, okay? That doesn't mean people didn't try. We had there's a couple instances where the state engineer approved applications to appropriate on the effluent of certain treatment works. Those are still approved and still employed. Back in 1961, Ogden City attempted to file an exchange application on sewer effluent in exchange with Warren Canal Company to use so that they could use that effluent from the treatment works and then exchange that for storage up in Pineview Reservoir. Those exchanges were rejected by the state engineer because it was, in essence, it was simply a new appropriation is really what they were getting after. So it was rejected. Ogden City challenged that in court, so it went to judicial review, as all decisions are able to do by the state engineer. But the district court confirmed the state engineer's decision, and Ogden City did not take it to the Supreme Court. So there was really no case law established by that, other than the state engineer did reject those exchange applications. And then in 1993, and there are probably people, I'm certain there are people who are in this room who are much more familiar with all the back room dealings that probably surrounded this draft piece of legislation. It was, I found a memo on file along with the draft legislation. The memo was from Fred Finlinson, who was the attorney for Central Valley Sewer District. As kind of promoting this proposed legislation, which essentially said, hey, the state engineer has no power to regulate effluent, and that the treatment works, the owner of the treatment works has a the unique right or the exclusive right to use all the effluent water. So in essence, it got rid of any tie to water rights that may have been associated with that effluent and just simply said the treatment works, they get to do whatever they want with that water, okay? That draft legislation remained draft for a reason. Because in 1995, they did institute a reuse law, but it was much more different than what was proposed by Fred and Central Valley. But it was different than what we have today. It was a little bit more, I guess, lax. And so it allowed municipalities to use effluent in a manner that was consistent with their underlying water rights. So if they had a municipal water right, they could use that effluent for municipal purposes, right? If they wanted to do something different, that, if it was water that was coming from the underlying water right was for a different use, they would have to file a change application. An interesting element of this law is that actually assigned a penalty, a priority penalty to that effluent use based on the date of the change application, if a change application was needed. But the most interesting or the most important aspect of this is it didn't require, the state engineer had no authority to reject or approve these. It was simply the municipalities providing notice to the state engineer that they intended to do this. And then the state engineer simply published that notice. There was no authority for the state engineer to approve or deny or anything along those lines. And that held in place up until 2005. So in 2006, a new reuse statute was implemented. It introduced this concept of a reuse authorization contract, which I'll discuss in a later slide. It required application and approval of the Water Quality Board at the time. And it required application approval by the state engineer. So you had two state agencies who were involved in the approval of these reuse applications. It made reuse subject to the provisions of the typical application, application processes that the state engineers usually associates with appropriation, where they apply, the state engineer makes a decision, there can be reconsideration requested and go to judicial review. And then it also eliminated that priority penalty if there was a change application and simply just omitted that language. So we had that from 2006 all the way up through 2022. And then the last legislative session, we had some pretty significant changes as a result of some of the things that were going on within the Great Salt Lake Basin. And so a lot of the statute that we presently have was evolved as a result of the discussions of that legislative session, where the Great Salt Lake was kind of the key element that people were concerned about. And so some of the few changes, one, they changed the approval authority from the Board of Water Quality to the Division Director of the Division of Water Quality. Of course, I'll let Director Mackey address his role in that in a subsequent presentation. It did add an exception for reuse by industrial facilities to it. And then probably the more important provision is it prohibited both the Division of Drinking Water and the state engineer from approving reuse applications that were filed in the Great Salt Lake Basin with a few certain exceptions. The exceptions were if they were federal water rights, if it was reuse that was intended for the Great Salt Lake, or if it had a replacement plan, okay, meaning that whatever they reused, they had to replace it to the Great Salt Lake. And then there was this last one that, hey, if you get your applications filed before November 1st, 2023, don't worry about those other elements. So you can only imagine, here are the number of sewage effluent reuse applications we've received over since the dawn of time. You can see it held pretty close to zero for most of the 20-year history, and then 2023 we had about 46 of them. So when I talk about incentives, you can see that there was an incentive for a lot of entities who may have had reuse on the horizon, but saw some of these provisions coming into place and saw that, well, that might not necessarily align with how they intended to use that effluent. And so they all filed for reuse applications prior to that November 1st deadline. So I'm going to kind of walk us through the statutory provisions as it currently is today. This might be a little bit dry, a little bit more technical, but I'll try to hit the high notes on this, okay? And I'm just going to take it section by section. All right, so there's a lot of definitions in section 102. I'm just going to touch on a few of them. First is the publicly owned treatment works. This is something that's been in definition for a while. It's also in definition in water qualities statute. But what I want to key in on here is it publicly owned treatment works. So these reuse applications don't apply to privately owned treatment works. Okay, it's got to be a public entity. Water reuse project, essentially, and I put this in here because I wanted to highlight the carve out for the industrial processes. So in essence, a reuse project means reuse for domestic wastewater that requires approval by both the Division of Drinking Water and the State Engineer's Office, but it does not include water reused at or by an industrial facility for operating or processing purposes. So if an industrial facility has effluent and they continue to reuse that inside their internal industrial processes, they are excluded from needing a reuse application. Public agency, again, I just want to highlight that private entities cannot apply for reuse authorization, or reuse, they can't apply to reuse the effluent, all right? It's got to be a public entity, a subdivision of the state, those various, and those definitions are there. And then this is kind of the thing that, again, was not unique to this. You know, this was passed back in 2006, but this is important because when we received a lot of these reuse applications, we had to return a lot of them as incomplete. And I was actually introduced by Leland Myers just at lunch as the most hated man in the Great Salt Lake Basin because we had to return all of these. And I said, no, that's not me, that's Teresa. She's the most hated woman. Because there was a lot of applications that were just incomplete. They hadn't looked at the provisions of the reuse authorization contract. And so really, if you think of it at its most fundamental level, you have essentially, if you have a unity in owner between the water right, the treatment works, and the use, you don't need a reuse authorization contract. But if there's any distinction between those three elements, if you have a different water right owner and a different owner of the treatment works, or a different owner of the treatment works and different who it's going to be used by, you need this contract in place as part of the application. And that can be really tricky, especially if the underlying water right is owned by the federal government, which we have a lot of federal projects, and a lot of some entities were using their contracts with these the federal water rights, such as Central Utah Water Conservancy District, but the base rights are owned by the federal government. So suddenly you've got to negotiate with the federal government as part of this. And obviously that is never an easy thing to do. So we certainly understand the concerns, but that's what's in statute. Okay, moving on. So water reuse in the Great Salt Lake Basin. This is a new component of the statutory provisions. And this essentially says, hey, the state engineer or the director of Division of Water Quality are prohibited from approving water reuse projects if the water related to the reuse project would have otherwise been discharged into a tributary of the Great Salt Lake. So it's like, hey, you cannot do this if that water was going to the Great Salt Lake. But there are some exceptions. And notice it says this section does not apply. So section 103, it's important. It will come into play later on, right? And these are the four kind of exceptions I already touched on. You know, it does not apply to a water right owned by the federal government, does not for a reuse project to supply water to the Great Salt Lake, a reuse project subject to a water replacement plan, which we'll talk about, or if the reuse applications were filed before November 1st, 2023, which again was the catalyst to all of those applications being filed, at least for my foxhole, right? But again, this exception just says, hey, this provision, this section, 103, does not apply to those. So I think a lot of people saw that, hey, if we file our application before November 1st, 2023, we will not have to do a water replacement plan, right? And I think that was the kind of the understanding at the time when a lot of those applications were filed. So let's talk about reuse by owners versus contract holders. So again, if you're a public agency and you own the water right and the publicly owned treatment works, you can do a reuse application. The underlying water right has to be a municipal water right. It has to be consistent with the underlying water right. There can't be any enlargement, and you've got to maintain the return flows. It's got to be approved by the state engineer and Director Mackey, and a change application has got to be filed if you intend to use it for something else. And the reason why that last provision is kind of important, because we've had a lot of discussion about, well, if we want to reuse water for the benefit of the Great Salt Lake, we want to do a reuse plan to benefit the Great Salt Lake, well, a municipal right does not fit in the context of water to satisfy ecological purposes of the Great Salt Lake. So that's where a change application would be required in order to make sure that the reuse was consistent with the underlying right. And then you have a reuse by a public agency that's under a contract. Again, this is where that reuse authorization contract comes in place. So if there's not unity of title between the water right itself, the treatment works, or the who's going to be using the water, the service area. So for instance, if you're a city and you're trying to get reuse out of a treatment works and you're going to use it for benefit of some other city, then a reuse authorization contract kind of brings them all onto the same sheet of music so that you all know what you're doing. Okay, I am not going to spend a lot of time on this because Director Mackey is going to speak, but obviously one of the provisions of this statute, and I'll just kind of give you my perspective, is that although the statute was drafted originally, even back in 2006, to make sure that both water quality and the state engineer were both on the same sheet of music, occasionally reuse permits were issued potentially without having a reuse application through the state engineer's office, and there was some confusion. So there was this statutory provision that was modified that said, hey, the Division of Water Quality cannot approve a reuse permit until the state engineer has authorized it under this chapter. So this just kind of made it more clear as kind of the sequence of events that the applicants had to go through, the gates that they had to go through. And again, I'll let Director Mackey address his role in that. Okay, so let's talk about application to the state engineer. And so the state engineer can, in the statute, it talks about a condition, the approval is conditioned. And this is why it's conditioned, because it's really conditioned. We're going to approve it, but then it's conditioned that the Director of Division of Water Quality approves it as well, right? And so sometimes that through some applicants for a loophole, you have to get a conditional and then go to the water quality, then come back to the state engineer. No, you just come to the state engineer, we approve it from our perspective, then you can go to the water quality and then they can approve it or deny it or however they want to act on it. But we also may impose some conditions on our approval to ensure that downstream water rights are not impacted. We have a whole list of statutory provisions that we've got to carve through to make sure that there's no impairment to existing rights. Here is what the reuse application needs to have. And again, a lot of the applications we received were missing some of these components, which is what then resulted in us returning them to the applicants saying, hey, we are returning this to you, and if you don't fix it within 30 days, we will just consider it not filed. Again, generated a lot of concern, understandably so, from a lot of applicants, but it also helped us work with them to work through the process. So some of the things are obvious, applicant's name, not a big deal, but I want to focus in on estimated quantity of water to be reused. Obviously, we need to know how much water you're going to reuse. We need to understand what your portfolio of water rights is. So when the state engineer approves applications to appropriate or evaluates a municipality's water rights, they have a portfolio of water rights, and in that portfolio, they'll have a diversion limitation, but they also have a depletion limitation. And typically, when a municipality appropriates a new water right, they'll appropriate a municipal right, and we've generally considered those municipal rights to be 100% consumptive. Got it, thanks. However, sometimes they will take an irrigation right and turn it into a municipal right through a change application, and their depletion won't be the same as their diversion. And so you'll have municipalities that have a portfolio where they have a lot bigger diversion than depletion. And the whole purpose of the reuse application process is for the state engineer to go through it and say, all right, show us your portfolio, show us your actual depletion going on. You're diverting this much, how much are you depleting? Then we're going to compare that to your portfolio of water rights and say, all right, of your authorized depletion, this is how much you have left to deplete, and then we're going to use that in conditioning the approval of the reuse, just to make sure they're not going to exceed what the depletion limitations of their portfolio requires. A reuse authorization contract, we've already kind of touched on that. The state engineer follows typical application notice provisions, and then we issue an order of state engineer. It's subject to judicial review. Okay, here's the more important part that's more relevant to the Great Salt Lake, and I apologize, I'm doing this right at the end. I'll try to touch on the key points. So under this existing statute, you can't enlarge the existing rights, you got to maintain return flows. But also, again, so we're in section 302 now, not section 103. It still has this requirement that, hey, if you're going to reuse water in the Great Salt Lake Basin or use water that would have otherwise been tributary to the Great Salt Lake, you've got to have a replacement plan. And so these are some of the issues we are currently working with a lot of the reuse applicants to say what a replacement plan looks like in order to keep the Great Salt Lake whole. And obviously, you can imagine there's some concern from some of these municipalities who had this reuse bucket of water on their long-range plan, and providing a replacement plan to the Great Salt Lake doesn't quite align with what their plan has been. So there's been a lot of discussion on how to satisfy this provision of statute, and these discussions are ongoing. And this is kind of the final bit. The state engineer can approve or deny an application for reuse, or we can approve in part, and we can condition these things, again, just to make sure that the statutory provisions are satisfied. And upon approval, the applicants are required to report all their ongoing water uses, just to make sure they're not going to exceed those depletion limitations. And with that, I think I'm done. And I think we'll save questions for the end, so thank you.
Sit right behind you, okay?
Perfect.
Okay, if you can't see me, you're lucky. Secondly, this is the second presentation out of 3 from an engineer. That makes you unlucky, because engineers are boring. We tend to think we know everything, and only one of the 3 of us do. So, I was asked to talk about water reuse in the Great Salt Lake Basin, and Lynn called me up and said, I want you to talk about this. And the reason she did that is because I wrote a report on water reuse that started this whole thing going. And then I had to do a presentation to the Water Development Council, and they asked me, why are you here? And I said, because Representative Snyder told me to come and do this. And they said, what is your ask? And I said, I don't know. It's his desire to have me here. And he said, well, the ask is going to be, we're going to change the law, which they did. And that started this whole ball rolling about what we're going to do with water reuse. Well, not all water recycling is good. Is that true or false? There's a book I read to one of my grandkids once. It was called Water is Water. And I'm going to tell you that water is water is water is water. So when we say reuse water, we're really just talking about water. And it's what people do with the water that makes a difference. In the case of reuse, there are lots of defined things that people say we're going to use it for. But it's just developing additional water for people to use. And the big one that really is kind of true, and one of the reasons people are doing it, is because it provides resilience to your water reliable and for a reliable water supply. Because if we constantly reuse it, all we have to replace is what we lost. And so at least for home water supply, it's not all that bad of an idea. Reuse can be done in a lot of different ways. And I would read this list to you if it made any difference, but I'm not going to. But I'm going to tell you that there are different types of reuse. So one reuse is non-potable reuse, meaning we're going to take it and treat it just well enough that we can stick it on your lawn, and if your kid runs through the sprinkler, they don't die. The second one is potable reuse. That's where we're going to treat it just well enough that you can drink it and you don't die. And then the last one is the kind of reuse that goes on all the time anyway, because most wastewater plants discharge to a water body that somebody else uses for water. So reuse is occurring. I mean, there's a study done on the Mississippi that I read once, and this is one of those studies where, okay, I have to explain one more thing. I am a sewer worker, and we have our own terminology. So if one of those terminologies come out while I'm talking, it's because it's a professional term. If you don't like that term, get over it. So, water is water is water is water. And you're going to reuse water no matter where it came from if you need that water. So, the favorite one is toilet to tap water. Now, for most of you, that would be sort of gross, right? Except that study I mentioned said that the average individual living in New Orleans is drinking water that came out of the Mississippi River that went through 7 bodies before it got to him or her. Is the study real? Well, who cares? It was it made a lot of good reading. It's like, you know, I listened to a study, just a few seconds ago on groundwater seeping into the Great Salt Lake, and I've heard vastly different numbers of how much gets there. Wink, wink at Lynn over here. And it's one of those things we just don't know yet, so people take a stab at it. And so 7 sounded like a good number. But people don't necessarily like toilet to tap, but it's what's going to be happening and is already going that direction. Now, if we're going to do direct potable reuse, we're going to treat that water to a standard that makes it such that you're probably not going to get harmed by it. In Utah, we have no direct potable reuse today. Will we? I don't know. That makes sense if we want reliability of water supply, especially in extreme drought, but today it's not there. How does potable water affect the reuse affect the Great Salt Lake? Well, first of all, I got to talk about water people. Who in here works for a water district? Or works for a city in the water department? Okay. See, water folks, they live in a whole different world. Sewer people, we're insignificant. Water people think they're gods. and they think that they are in control of everything. The example is if a sewer person, a water person, and a legislator are all in the same room, and you put them on a scale from the floor to the ceiling, the sewer person politically is 1 step above the floor. The legislator is at the ceiling, but the water people are 2 stories above that. They're the ones who think they make all the rules when it comes to water. And so they think that this water's theirs. And it's always going to be their right to use it. And on the Great Salt Lake, well, that may or may not be beneficial. So a water person is going to do a lot of planning. I was on a board for a large water district, metropolitan water district, and it was really interesting because they would talk about all the planning we need to do to make sure that we have a robust, resilient, and adequate water supply. Now, when I was listening to all those meetings, I was also working on Great Salt Lake, and I'm thinking like, but shit, where are you talking about this water being lost from the ecosystem? I use that professional term again because I was frustrated at the moment. But they didn't care. They wanted a robust water supply. They even talked about taking all of the effluent and putting it back into aquifer storage and recharge so we can pump it out later and put it into the drinking water supply. All of these problems that may be created by it, we're not looking at or being addressed. And so we would see graphs like this all the time. And the gray would represent, that's the stable water supply that existed. But they were always saying, as people and populations grow, we're going to need more water. And every one of those little colored bars was another source of water they were talking to develop, one of which was always water reuse. Because if we reuse it again, we can make it go further. We can also deplete it more so it doesn't return to the environment. So at the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council level, we decided we were going to look at modeling what happens to the Great Salt Lake based upon, and you can read this if you want, if you've got good eyes. But I just put it up there because it looked kind of cool. So we put together, and it was established, the GSLIM model, the Great Salt Lake Integrated Water Management Model, to see what happens with water. And we said, we're going to look at different scenarios. And more importantly, what do those scenarios do to the Great Salt Lake? And so one scenario was, well, how we're doing things today. Another scenario was how we did it 20 years or 10 years ago, because that was worse. We're doing better today. And then another scenario was, but what if we have continuous population development and growth, and we have climate variability? Well, that's climate change. For those who don't like the term, we just use variability. And then we said, and what happens if we don't change anything and we just have really significant growth? And so if you look at this graph, the model said, and this was done in 2018, so it didn't really find out that we were going to get worse by 2022 than even the model suggested. But it showed that we are in a real precarious place when it comes to Great Salt Lake elevation. That water level, no matter what we do, is going to not get a lot better. But by doing a lot, we can prevent it from getting worse. And so that's when we started talking about what does this mean from water conservation, and also what does it mean for water reuse. And I'll get to what the impact of water reuse is in a minute if you take and try and do it. But first I want to talk about conservation. We did a study at the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. You know, it's really good because I can hardly see you if you were over here. And then I wouldn't even have to know I was out of time. So we did a study at the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council looking at water conservation. What levels of conservation are necessary? Now, we looked at we went and worked with each of the large water suppliers, and we said, what are we going to have to do? And so we had all these nice objectives, and we put it together, and then we looked at their water supply, and we said, what does that tell us? And so this graph says, I've got blue is my existing water supply. This is for Weber Basin. The red line is where I could end up with a need if my water development or if my usage didn't go down from, I think that was like a 2005 level, but we got better. So the black line represents where we need to be if we're going to continue with growth, and our continued use of water today, that exceeds the existing water supply. And so what we said is, tell us what it takes to live within the existing developed water supply. That would be no new Bear River projects, no new reuse, no new any water development, because that was the goal. If we can develop, if we can have population growth and the effects of climate change and still live within an existing water supply, we can keep natural systems at least consistent with where they are today, which is really kind of a good goal. Maybe better would be better, but at least that doesn't deplete it worse. And so we looked at it from those who had potable water, those who had irrigation water, and we said, what is it we need to do? And we came up with a whole table here saying all the actions we have to take. But to make that simple to read, we need to convert every home to 100% water-saving fixtures. Now, there's a thing about water reuse and water going down your toilet. Don't tell anybody, but I won't yell at you if you waste water in your house, because it's going to go down the sewer, into the treatment plant, and into the Great Salt Lake. Win-win. But if you waste water outside, you're a sorry sucker. We need to reduce the turf in the existing turf from 80% of turf areas to 20% to live within existing water supplies. So, what does that mean? Well, I'm guessing there are some people here who haven't completely xeriscaped their yard yet. I'm going to go more into that shaming in a minute. If water reuse is allowed, it allows water to remain in a natural system. That's good. But if water reuse is used to water lawns, and we get I don't know what the haircut on water going on the lawns, but I've heard it's as much as 85% loss to evapotranspiration, that's bad for the Great Salt Lake. So, if we take into a calculation of the available water today out of wastewater treatment plants in the Great Salt Lake Basin, and say that 75% of the time you can reuse some of that water, meaning that we're going to have an annual reuse of 50% only of the water coming out of a wastewater treatment plant, with 273,000 acre-feet today of water flowing out of those plants into the Great Salt Lake ecosystem. That means you're going to lose 10 to 20 more inches of lake elevation on average, worse than the whole Bear River development project. So water reuse is actually worse for the lake than the Bear River project, which ain't good either. So what do we need to do? Well, there's a cost associated with it, and sadly, that cost is actually cheaper than developing some new water supplies. So what we have to do is go to the win-win situation where we go to conservation. So here comes the shaming part. If your yard looks like that, shame on you. Those of you who want to stand up and debate with me whether or not this perfectly green, not one stick of yellow grass is the right way to keep your yard looking, I want you to do it now. No, I don't see.
Preach, Leland, preach.
So, wait a minute. We can stand it today like this, but we don't like it. So this person at least is not watering overwatering. Might get a few brown patches, but still, what are they going to do with that park strip except look at it? I don't bet you there's not one kid that plays soccer on that park strip. Not one. I'll bet you the only thing you might find somebody doing is using it to tee off golf balls at their neighbor's houses when they're mad. But beyond that, I don't know what it is. This is a lot better. Now, sadly, I'm going to get to the point where those who represent cities should be ashamed, because they're telling us in many cases that there has to be a certain amount of green space and even a park strip. What are you going to use that green space in the park strip for? To make yourself feel good? No, this is better. This is good in your front yard. But again, many of the cities have ordinances. Some of them reduced it. I know one large city that reduced it from saying, well, you got to have 60 or 70%. We're all the way down to 30%. Well, maybe that's not far enough yet to reach those conservation goals we need everybody in this room to meet. So if you look like the first picture, then you got to consider, are you doing your part for the Great Salt Lake? Because as all those new people move in, I live in Sugar House. Now, in Sugar House, if you've been there lately, it's like this is wall-to-wall new development of huge apartment blocks, right? If you've been in a sugar house, you'll know that. But that's good because they don't have lawn. And so they might flush, but they're not going to use a lot of external outside water going into evapotranspiration. That actually for the Great Salt Lake is a good deal. It is not so good if I want to drive from my house to get anywhere anymore, but it is a good deal from the water use standpoint. Here are two houses that I have intimate knowledge about. One of them happens to be a relative of mine, and the other one happens to be a very close relative of mine. And I took the water use, same household size, across a year. Now, the one uses a lot more water during the winter. Long showers, you know, and I'm not going to yell at them at that. But when they're using 60,000 gallons a month to water their yard to keep it look like that first picture, that's not going to fly with the level of conservation needed. And we need ordinances that force those who want the green grass to change if they won't change on their own. Now that's kind of draconian and kind of authoritarian. But if people are not willing to change, what are you going to do about it? You know, it's the water shaming in California when Oprah Winfrey brought truckloads of water in to keep her grass green. At some point, even the rich folks might have to cut back a little on water use. And it's doable. That's what this graph tells you, it's doable. Because the bottom line used to look like the upper line. So you can do it. Here's the pictures I stole off the internet about changing ordinances, because this doesn't meet the current ordinance that that house is in. Now, I don't know if, is Erica Gaddis here today? I don't know. I think the picture is actually Erica Gaddis there. So if you know Erica, tell her I used her picture on it. But the yard doesn't meet all of the ordinances that are in place today, and municipalities need to fix that. The Great Salt Lake Advisory Council is trying to put together a toolkit. Where's Lily? Lily over here is going to be putting together a toolkit that's going to help distribute it to municipalities, saying how far do you need to go? Because a lot of them don't see the need to go that far yet, because if you go back to that graph showing the water supply, they still have water. But they won't in the future if we don't develop new water supplies, and developing new water supplies impacts the Great Salt Lake, full stop. And there's been a lot of talk about agricultural optimization. We need that too, right? Because if we model it and we put a good degree of agricultural modification in there with significant home conservation, we can keep the lake stable and maybe even make it up to 4198 on an ongoing basis. But if we don't, we're not going to do it. We might pat ourselves in the back, we might tell ourselves how good we are, but if each and every one of us here today is not doing significant conservation, we're not doing all we should be doing to make it better for the lake. So, pictures of nice agricultural conservation, all of these things need to be done on par. Municipal and industrial M&I water supplies need to have conservation applied. Oh, I'm going to be done way before 5 minutes. That has to be done now, because new development is going to continue and we're not going to stop it. There was another good, see if he's here, I don't want to use his name, another good friend who got up in a meeting and said, I know the problem with our water problems in Utah. And he said, we have too many children and we just need to stop it in a public meeting. And I'm going, all right, you're right there. You just lost the battle. No one's going to listen to you on this issue. So that's not the answer. The answer is reducing our usage to live within those water supplies. Number two, we need on-farm irrigation to improve the efficiency of the water that is used, so allow some of that to get down to us. And by the way, if you improve your efficiency, don't just open up new acres of land, let the water flow. And then finally, save water needs to be shepherded to the Great Salt Lake. That's been talked about enough today. But it's an important factor. It was in a legal analysis we did at the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council years ago. And today it's even more important in order to be able to measure how we save water. And with that, questions? If not, thank you.
Do we have time for comments to Leland? Leland, I have two comments / questions. The first regarding the park strips and landscaping. I think it's important to point out that we can grow native plants on our park strips, and they only need water to establish. They won't use water in the long term, so I don't want to live in a city that's just a giant pile of gravel.
I agree that I'm in favor of it not being a pile of gravel, but I'm not in favor of making it so that this assumption is it has to be green.
Yeah.
You know,
Yep.
if it's native, if I want to plant a sage bush, let me plant a sage bush.
Yeah.
If I want to plant a really nice looking rock, I want to be able to do that too.
Yeah, thank you. And then the second is the conversation around indoor water use, and it's fine to be wasteful with our indoor water. I think we need to think about that too. We can drain all the reservoirs right now by taking really, really long showers, and we'll fill the Great Salt Lake really quickly.
I only said that because that water still makes it to the Great Salt Lake. So from the standpoint of a water purveyor, he doesn't want to be able to lose his reservoir. But if you put that whole reservoir in the Great Salt Lake, it might make me happy today.
Yeah, but short term. In the long term, if we conserve our
I
water,
agree. I
right,
agree.
and then our water use planning factors in low per capita use, we don't need the Bear
And
River
that's why we
project.
said we need 100% conversion to water saving fixtures and
Yeah.
analysis on it. So I agree with you. I'm just being sarcastic, sorry. It's a bad habit. Comes from working in the sewer.
Thank you both. Nice little debate.
All set. Hi, everybody. The third engineer in a row, and I know that somebody said Leland Myers is the most hated person on the Great Salt Lake. Absolutely not true. The only thing I hate is having to follow him because he's a really tough act to follow, right? I'm the director of the Division of Water Quality. I am also a registered certified wastewater treatment operator. But that's a restricted license, so I think I'm restricted from using all of the sewer terms as well. Thank you, Lynn. Thanks, friends, for putting all this together. I know it's a huge amount of work and how successful. It's just wonderful to have everybody here and the opportunity to talk a little bit about water quality. Lynn asked me to talk about the role of the Division of Water Quality in reuse of wastewater in the Great Salt Lake area. And that's what I'm going to attempt to do. So I probably can beat the record on time. So these are my main topics. Talk about some of the reuse projects that are already here in the Great Salt Lake Basin. Our specific role, and then some general comments on reuse and its connection with water quality. I'm going to start out with a little bit of history. So roughly, the amount of water that current treatment plant capacity can deliver to back into waters of the state. Round numbers, 500,000 acre feet a year. Today, what is used through reuse is about 4,000 acre feet per year. So a lot more room. So all that water that's not being reused, of course, today is making its way. Now that 500,000 acre feet is a little bit misleading. Recognize that most reuse that occurs is outdoor irrigation, right, which can only happen half the year. So that cuts that number in half for what might be depleted from the Great Salt Lake. So there's a variety of different types of ways and reasons that wastewater is reused. Here's a list. Irrigation, for sure, is the most common. We have this one that we, sort of a term of art for us, call an alternative point of discharge. And I'll explain that in a second. There are other applications or other places where wastewater reuse, by definition, occurs for protection of surface water and drinking water sources, surface water and groundwater sources. So they're a little bit odd. Most of those are in rural areas where septic tanks occur, and they put at risk drinking water sources. So when someone wants to develop, usually a hotel, in an area where there's pristine and limited groundwater, they look for other alternatives than gigantic septic tanks, which will inevitably contaminate the drinking water source. And so they will go to what is effectively reuse by surface disposal of the water. Leland mentioned toilet to tap, direct to potable. There is interest in the state. Most of you probably know, there's a pilot study that's put together by South Jordan. I believe that they are approved as I'll say provisional for lack of the proper word, public water supply, so that they can actually serve that water to transient populations as a demonstration. So it's not just theoretical. There is intention for some to move to that level of treatment. I'm going to make one correction to something that Leland said, the thing about the Mississippi River, and if you live in New Orleans, your water is passed through 6 or 7 bodies. By the time it gets to you, actually, I would say it's passed through 6 or 7 sets of kidneys, which are, as we all know, reverse osmosis mechanisms, so should be providing a pretty good water quality. Before I move on, just one of the things about this fairly low amount of reuse, I think it's on the next slide, you'll see there's still a fair number of facilities that are currently reusing wastewater in Utah. I think it's around 24 or so in the Great Salt Lake Basin. So why so many facilities and such a small amount of reuse? Well, they're small facilities. And the larger facilities, certainly the 4 biggest facilities in the Great Salt Lake Basin, are hardly, if at all, doing any kind of reuse. There is use for industrial purposes, that is on their facilities, and a little bit of other on-site application. But the big facilities, it hasn't caught on, right? They haven't moved to increasing those numbers, those 4,000 acre-feet per year, up into the hundreds of thousands of acre-feet per year. And of course, with the latest change in the statute in 73-3C, that's going to be longer coming, probably, before we can get to that level of reuse. But back to the small facilities. So why do we have small facilities that are reusing, which we usually think about as requiring a higher level of technology instead of the large facilities? And there's a couple reasons. I think the main reasons are, one is most of those small facilities, they're technologically limited. A lot of those facilities are lagoons. And part of the reason they're lagoons is they service smaller populations, and smaller populations have much more difficulty generating the revenue that's necessary to upgrade facilities for higher levels of treatment, higher levels of reuse. So I'm going to give you an example, and this is the alternative point of discharge example that I'd like to share. So, City of Heber. Back in the late 70s, Heber was discharging from their wastewater treatment plant into Deer Creek Reservoir, and Deer Creek Reservoir had a problem. It had an algae growth problem that was great concern to the Provo River water users. Algae, you get enough algae in water, it's at least going to cause you to have shorter filter run times, and probably in part color and odor into your water, and this was a concern. So in the early 80s, Heber City got a grant and built their non-discharging facilities. That is, they bought land and built a farm, installed the farm, as well as some other important improvements to their wastewater treatment lagoon system, so that they can have 100% reuse and eliminate their discharge. Remember NPDES, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, pretty early on in the Clean Water Act, 72, this happened in the early 80s, eliminating that discharge to Deer Creek Reservoir, and Deer Creek Reservoir really improved. Didn't get perfect, still challenged. There's other inputs of pollution, nutrients into Deer Creek that still allow some algae production to occur, but remarkable improvement, really a big success story in Utah in being able to protect a very important drinking water supply by implementing reuse. The other point I want to make about that is little teeny tiny plant. I think last year around 1,500 acre feet, and this is 365 days a year. Now they don't land apply 365 days a year, but they have big storage capacity at Heber. So no discharge, 1,500 acre feet per year into the Provo is protecting this really important reservoir. So small investment, big gain from a reuse system. Okay, so here's just some numbers on POTWs already defined by Blake in the state. 159, most of those are lagoon systems. Among lagoons, vast majority are non-discharging. Total of 39 reuse facilities in the state, and in the Great Salt Lake Basin, what did I say? 23 reuse, and that's a mix of type 1 and type 2 reuse systems. So Leland used the terms potable and non-potable. Those terms type 1 and type 2 have to do with the frequency of contact that the public can experience. So type 2 is a lower level of treatment, it's secondary level of treatment. So there's still pathogens present, but it is at least behind a fence with some setback and restrictions so that the public won't access those sites. If you want to irrigate a school or a park, for example, where kids are going to play soccer, that's type 1 water. And we have rules that require different levels of treatment, different levels of quality for those waters, type 1 being the more restrictive. From a technical standpoint, you can basically think about it as filters or no filters. Okay, so Blake went through the 73 3C history, which I thought was fantastic. It was interesting to see that at one point the POTWs were given the right to all that water. Or I guess they weren't given it, it was proposed. So that would have been interesting, certainly not the case. When we implement or when we approve reuse projects, we're governed both by 73C and Title 19.5, which is the Water Quality Act. With the new change that happened in 2023, we got a lot of clarity from that rule. It certainly slowed down the rate of new projects because people had to take a step back and really evaluate first their water rights situation. And this is different from prior to the rule where there was sort of parallel, usually conditioned approval processes between water rights and water quality. And we used to see projects all the time come before water rights had been proven out, certainly before there was any preliminary approval from the state engineer. And this is just the way projects work. When an entity, a city, or a developer is interested in moving forward their project, they either take the path of least resistance and pursue that one, usually because they'd like to get their permits approved and then be able to get a bank milestone payment, or they approach them in parallel, and they sort of say, yeah, well, we're working on that, please get me my approval over here. It's easy to get out ahead for one process, to get out ahead of the other process, and even though you might condition your approvals, sometimes things get legs, and especially when you're approving construction and loans have been closed and people are ready to move move forward with their process. We certainly have had situations where we have approved construction of projects before we had discharge permits implemented and got ourselves into trouble. So the clarity that the new statute, the 2023 amendments, made is really important for us. It sets a structure for those who are interested in getting approval for their processes. This is how you do it. And we like it. We don't have to do all the work that goes into a contract, into a reuse contract, to ask all those questions. All that work gets sorted out by the state engineer. Then we are simply approving reuse projects. Now, and when I say approve reuse projects, ultimately, what we will do is make sure that they are going to operate that system appropriately. It'll be constructed appropriately, and then we will regulate them, right? Because DWQ water quality is essentially an enforcement agency, right? So we're the right agency to be following through the life of those projects. So if you were to come and want to get a reuse permit or approval from us, there's a number of different steps that you might have to take depending on what type of project you have. Almost every project that is going to involve irrigation using reuse water, we'll take a look at it from a groundwater contamination standpoint. And you might end up with a groundwater permit, something that most people don't really care to have. But nonetheless, we look at the potential impact of a surface application of groundwater. Certainly, you're talking to our permitting folks. If there is going to be a change in the impact to receiving stream quality, assuming you have a discharging system as well, you're talking to our permitting folks, likely our standards folks. You have a plan review through our engineering section. Possibly, you might come and request financial assistance for this reuse project. We don't fund a lot of reuse projects for a couple of reasons. One is some reuse projects are water development, essentially projects, right? They don't have a water quality component. They don't intend to improve water quality. And our funding requires that there be a water quality benefit. So those projects are out. The other thing that has come up in the past a few times on funding is if you're a bank and somebody comes to you and says, I want to build a water treatment plant and I'm going to produce water for $2,000 an acre foot, but you can buy it for $300 an acre foot. Why is a bank going to lend you money? You're not going to be their highest priority because they're going to be concerned that you're getting a proper payback on your investment. So they're not the best projects for funding, but we have when there's an important water quality benefit. Okay, just sort of briefly, the basic steps to getting approval through us. First, you go to the state engineer and get your preliminary approval there. Then you come to us, and the first thing we'll ask you for is a project plan. And this is a report that says what you want to build, how you're going to build it, how you're going to maintain it, and and how you're going to monitor and operate the system. So it's a planning document. One that we can give you a preliminary approval on, which a lot of people want because it gets them a milestone, similar to a bank milestone or a performance progress milestone. After you have your project plan approved, you'll get a construction permit. Our rules, which is our 317-3-11 for reuse, say that anything you're building, anything you're going to constructing, collection lines, treatment works, distribution lines, have to be approved by the Division of Water Quality. We issue a construction permit for that. And then there's operating permits. And unfortunately, we have a few different types of permits. It depends on what your other permits are. So I mentioned like a Heber, they're a zero discharge permit, so they don't have a UPDES discharge permit from us. So they get a separate type of operating permit for the operation of their facility than if they also had a discharge permit. And there's a number of other variations that make things a little bit complicated. From our perspective, though, I mean, when we're reviewing and approving projects, what we're really trying to do is make sure that public health is going to be protected when wastewater is being reused. And then the technical aspects that the plan is sound and sustainable for the life of the project, 20, 30 years. Speaker mentioned balance. I thought it was good. I liked hearing him, mention all the major important interests in Great Salt Lake. Minerals companies, communities, agriculture, and environment. And I thought it was nice that the speaker recognized that in the 1960s, our appreciation for the environment and the importance of water quality and its ecosystem wasn't really recognized, and we've come so very far throughout society, throughout the public, and all the way up through the legislature to recognize the importance of the lake. So, as part of that finding balance, I think it's fairly obvious to everybody. We all recognize that depletions and drought have a harmful impact, have a bad impact on Great Salt Lake. I hope you also recognize that they have an adverse impact on almost all of the state's waters. We find that as we assess waters across the state, that the single largest category of water quality impairment is dissolved oxygen, temperature, and pH. More impairments there in both lakes and in rivers than in any other impairments, metals, anything else. And why? A lot of those impairments are not they're in cities too, but because of the number, a lot of those are out in the greater state. And the reason is that when we have drought and high levels of depletion, there's less flow in the streams, there's lower levels in the lakes, they get warm, and the dissolved oxygen can't be maintained for habitat. So this challenge that we have with the Great Salt Lake on flow, if you will, is ubiquitous across the state in all our waters. Part of what I know the HB 429 study is looking on, maybe it's a small part, but I think it's a really important part, is functional flows. And I'm not sure that I could really explain exactly what functional flows means, but kind of the bottom line is when we dry up streams, they aren't functional. They aren't functional for any of the uses. And there is minimum levels of flow in streams that should be maintained so that all the beneficial uses can be met. And I think it's really glad to see that the state is looking into understanding functional flows better. I think functional flows, for some, will help the POTWs as well. When a POTW is the stream, because the stream is just a trickle, they get much more stringent permits because they are the stream. There's no accounting for attenuation of pollutant loads in those streams when you basically are the stream. So having good, healthy streams also helps us manage our wastewaters in a better, more healthy way. I guess just sort of the last thing is the cost that we're looking at. You know, I talked about this, small facilities and how it was really more economical for a small lagoon to just get out of the stream with their discharge than it would be for them to build a complex new infrastructure and pay for it. When at the same time they had remarkable benefit to the water quality and an important water body. So low cost, high water quality reward, you know, we really like to see that. When we look at the other side of the equation, larger facilities, much more expensive to be able to build and implement an effective reuse system, especially if we're talking about using the volumes of water, you know, that have been suggested, hundreds of thousands of acre feet per year. So there's a cost balance there. We know that there is some good in reuse from being able to improve water quality, but where's the tipping point? I think we should try to understand that, because I think reuse is important in our conservation plans and in our community water quality plans. So I think, second to last slide. So just a couple of summary points. Reuse has been effective for improving water quality in small communities. You know, highly effective, and it's useful in developing conservation plans, as long as you recognize the cardinal things, which are you can't expand your water right, and you have to be consistent with the underlying rights, right? I appreciate the emphasis on conservation. Leland, thank you for protection of Great Salt Lake, and I think in so doing, we are going to benefit other waters as well. The waters that are the tributaries that will be delivering that water will be more healthy as a result of conservation. And of course, the need to balance costs and water quality with water quantity needs. And that is it.
We have 1 minute for questions.
Hey, thanks, John. Yeah, a question that take longer than a minute probably to answer, but just to add one more level of complexity. So Great Salt Lake being a saline lake and a terminal lake is quite different from every other water body that we have in the state. Best available science suggests it's nutrient limited. So one of the questions is, so you could treat all of the inflows to really high standards and have nice, clean, freshwater systems, and then it just means there's that much less fuel in the ecosystem of the Great Salt Lake. It takes the biology down a notch, right? So just any quick thoughts in terms of how do you balance that? Because that's one more thing. It's not just the water quantity question, but there's a water quality question where water quality for the Great Salt Lake may mean more nutrients rather than less.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And, you know, this is, you know, an important question. And I don't think I have the answer. I have a couple of comments. One is the Great Salt Lake has a lot of nutrients in it. Some of them are sequestered, but certainly relative to other waters, and granted, it's a saline lake, different ecosystem, it has a lot of nutrients, 10, 100 times more nutrients than in our fresh waters.
But nutrient limited relative to other terminal lakes, I'd just say best available science is it's nutrient limited. Could assimilate a lot more nutrients.
Sure. The other thing that I say, I mean, I think it's an important question, and there is a fuller analysis that's necessary. Along with, bringing nutrients into the Great Salt Lake, Terminal Lake, everything else we bring into the Great Salt Lake is impactful and won't be forgiving if we go too far, right? Metals are not going away, maybe sequestering, but all the other pollutants that we send there are going to stay. And so I think that we need to make sure that we understand, and I don't think we do, the broader picture of all the materials that go into the Great Salt Lake for its really long-term, forever protection.
Thanks.
Okay. When am I leaving?
Good evening, everybody. Not really sure what 5 o'clock entails. My name is Jonathan Jennings. I'm the meteorologist for the Division of Water Resources and the Cloud Seeding Coordinator. But just to kind of stick to the theme here, let's call myself an atmospheric engineer. That way the rest of the session is full of engineers. I'm going to talk today about cloud seeding in Utah, what's been going on, how this past season went, and what's ahead of us down the road. So, of course, the question needs to be asked, why do we cloud seed in Utah? Well, of course, it's a new, affordable water production. This is some of the most affordable new water you can have. And also, we have very complex and diverse terrain, which allows for a lot of super cold liquid water to occur within our cloud. And what happens is you get a very rapid updraft along along the front ranges of the mountains, which transports these water droplets into the freezing level of the atmosphere too rapidly to where you don't have any freezing occurring. So the droplets become super cold, and we have a lot of issues with that. No ice nucleation is taking place because we don't have a lot of CCNs or cloud condensation nuclei. And we also don't have the droplet sizes that allow for growth via collision and coalescence. So because those droplets are very small, the surface area isn't big enough for freezing to occur, but also when they collide with each other, they tend to just bounce off of one another. So the clouds become very inefficient. As we'll learn, I think tomorrow afternoon, the dust issues that we have, dust particles are very hydrophobic in nature, so they aren't collecting that water droplets that we want, so the clouds are even less efficient. And of course, water demand is increasing, and then climate change or climate variability, as Leland said earlier, is an ongoing issue here in Utah. So real quick, looking at the snow water equivalent for the past 30 years, this is percent of normal, you can see that there's a lot of variability in there. In fact, over the last 30 years, we only had 2 years where we were within 5% of normal. So it is feast or famine. And with cloud seeding, we need to take advantage of those big years that we just had this past year and last year, because the resources are much more readily available for us to take advantage of. Those are the years that we could try to bank that water and get through some of those low drought years in order to continue to provide that sustainable water. Before I get into the methodology, I want to talk about the materials used, because this is always the first question we get. The main material that we use in Utah is silver iodide, and structurally it is very similar to an ice crystal. So when it comes in contact with that super cold liquid water, it turns into ice. You have to have temperatures around -5 Celsius to -20 Celsius for that to occur. And this is used both in snowpack augmentation, so what we're doing here in Utah, but also convective cloud seeding, which is ongoing in North Dakota and Texas. There's also a program here in Utah that uses liquid propane, and that creates a burst of evaporative cooling. And what's really cool about this is it freezes everything almost up to that 0 degree level. So everything that's all the super cool water in there, doesn't matter about the temperature, it's going to freeze. The issue is that the burst is typically in a smaller dispersion, so you're not going to affect a much larger area like the silver iodide. And you have to do it in cloud. You can't be below the cloud. More research is needed in this, but the Emery Water Conservancy District has been doing this for decades, and they're seeing some positive results. We're talking with a group in Idaho that's doing a research project in this, and hopefully we can learn a lot more about liquid propane. But of course, the big question is the environmental impacts of silver iodide. And fortunately, silver iodide is insoluble in water. So it hangs on to that free silver ion, which is the toxic part of silver. And when you combine silver with iodide and you look at the electronegativity of the two, you have a covalent bond that takes place. So the bond is like 0.49. If it's above 1.5, it'll start being soluble in water, and then it starts to get pretty bad. But the maximum concentration of silver in water when it's silver iodide is 0.984 micrograms per liter, which is below the background materials that we've already observed in states like Nevada, Idaho, California, and Utah. And it's also below the limits for safe drinking water, which is 100 micrograms per liter, aquatic life 4.1, and terrestrial plants, which is 10 to 10,000 micrograms per liter. But really, the biggest, I think, evidence that we have that this is safe is longevity. We've been doing cloud seeding in Utah for 50 years in some areas, and we are still seeing no impacts. So we'll talk about the methodology. Here in Utah, the biggest form of weather modification we do in cloud seeding is via ground-based generators, and here you can see one of the new remote generators. We rely on the orographic lift to transport the material over to clouds, and we get a really good dispersion from these generators, and it affects a large portion of the cloud. We have many of these generators well placed all throughout the state to target the target areas that we're working. For seedability, again, with silver iodide, you need that temperature, -5 to -20. You have to have favorable liquid water content, so anything over 0.5 to 1 grams per cubic meter. No blocking flow, no stability. You want to be able to see that dispersion go throughout. But if we do have that blocking flow and we do have some stability issues, we have a second way of cloud seeding, and that's our aerial programs, which are very new here in Utah. We're taking aircraft, we're flying in the cloud on an IFR flight path. So for non-pilots, that's instrument flight rules. And what's going on there is the pilots can't see anything outside. So they are working just off of their instruments. So it's a little risky operation, but that's why you have well-qualified pilots. You have a meteorologist that's working with them. And here we're able to target more precisely the clouds. We released the material via the burn-in-place flares you can see here, and it's just like a roadside flare. They have a button in the airplane, they light it, and it'll burn for 45 seconds to a minute, and it's dispersing silver iodide that way. You can't have icing conditions because then the plane would crash, so we have to be very careful with that. Pilot safety is, of course, number one. And then, of course, you're targeting in cloud, and then we do have ejectable flares where we could get above the cloud if we are experiencing icing. And just like little shotgun shells, they'll shoot the flare down into the cloud, and they take about 45 seconds to burn as they get into the cloud. So it gives us a little flexibility to not only, if we have that stability issue that we're having, blocking flow, but also during the early part of the season and late season, we could be a lot more precise with the targeting. So here are the target areas of Utah. We have currently 7 programs across the state. You can see all the generators. Those are the manual generators, so these are on mostly people's properties, and the meteorologists call them up and say, hey, you know, we have a good storm coming in, could you turn the generators on? And then when it's over, they call them and ask them to turn it off. But this year we were able to deploy 24 new remote generators, so these are starting to be sited in more remote areas, and the meteorologists could just turn them on via a program on their laptop. So we have 24 out now. The plan is to get another 30 to 40 out this next season. And by the end of our 3-year plan, we're hoping to have anywhere from 120 to 160 remote generators. And these are being a supplement to the manual generators. So we're trying to increase the density of the network. We're trying to expand our programs and really make everything else work much more efficiently. So funding has been going on by the state since 1974, and I apologize, I think I have the blue and the gray flipped, because the funding from the state, it's been a 50-50 cost share, and then in 2023, we got the funding from the legislature, so you saw a really big increase from the state, and that's going towards the aerial programs, the building of the remote generators, expansion of some of the programs, and we're still working on a 3-year strategic plan to start spending some of this money. I wanted to make sure I recognize the sponsors of the programs. You can see each of the target areas, who the sponsors are. North American Weather Consultants, they're based out of Sandy. They do all the meteorology work and operations. The Utah Climate Center helps assist us with modeling. And then Radiometrics, they're providing us with some radiometers that we're going to be using to look at the liquid water in the clouds. But we're also doing a project trying to bring gap-filling radars to the state of Utah so we can start seeing these storms in better coverage. So not everybody could come to Utah and just start cloud seeding. We do have a licensing and permitting process. To achieve a license, you have to have a bachelor's in meteorology or a related field, 5 years of cloud seeding experience, or experience that the cloud seeding coordinator thinks is enough to fit to receive a license. To apply for a permit, you have to have an operations plan. You have to have a notice of intention run into statewide newspaper. That way, if public has any comment, they can have a means to do so. Show proof of financial responsibility, and then there's a lot of reporting requirements, both at the state and federal level with NOAA. We do have suspension criteria in place. Excess snowpack accumulation we keep an eye on, rain-induced winter floods, severe weather, so if there's a flood warning or thunderstorm warning, which sometimes can happen during the winter, we'll suspend. And then the Water Resources does have a suspension criteria in place looking at the 95th percentile of spring runoff. We also do keep an eye on avalanche conditions, make sure that we're operating safely and not getting anyone in trouble with the avalanche situations. But we're also open to sponsor input, and that's one of the great things about having sponsors is getting some feedback from them and letting us know exactly what the conditions are. Because sometimes these SNOTEL sites or rain gauge sites, they're too sparse, and we can't really get a good idea of exactly what's going on. So operationally, since 2016, when a lot of the reporting has been most consistent, we're seeing the generators run for anywhere from 12,000 to 14,000 hours a season. We've had a couple really good years. So the latest year's on the left. So 2023 was a great season, obviously. There was some suspension in place during last season. But the Southern Utah being the largest, they operate the most. But from program to program, we're going to look at the high Uintas program. The blue is a 9-year average, and the orange there is what occurred this season. And you can see things were pretty slow to start the season off, and then things really picked up in mid-January, right when I moved here. So the Six Creeks program, that's the one just up the road from us. They also had a really good season. Central Southern struggled a bit this year, although their snowpack was great. There were a lot of issues with the wind flow. We were getting more parallel winds to the mountains as opposed to perpendicular winds. So the program didn't run as much as we had hoped it would have. And then, of course, of concern here, the Northern Utah program was right on pace up through the end of March when it started to do a little bit better. And then the Western Uintas program had a pretty good season. These are all from the manual generators too, so nothing here from the remotes. We'll get to that in a second. The Book Cliffs program is pretty new. We don't have a whole lot of consistent reporting with that just yet. And then Emory as well. We're trying to work with getting some better reporting out of them, something that I'm certainly going to help them with. But going back to the state-owned generators, I left the X up there because I was still waiting to get the report back, and I did get it back this morning. So the 24 remote generators that the state owns ran for 2,200 hours, which exceeds my expectations. I was thinking they would run maybe 50 hours a generator, but they were close to 100 hours per generator. January and February alone, they were very busy, 985 total hours just in those 2 months. And there were some questions about how these would do out in the elements. Well, we had one generator that had a foot of snow over it, and it still ignited remotely and was able to produce for us. So we're seeing proof of great reliability. The only issue we had was one of them did get blown over in a windstorm, but that was a minimal issue. So yeah, we're creating a higher density network of these generators, and the expansion is going to continue into next season. So looking at the aerial programs, it's kind of hard to see, but the flight tracks on the map to the left, those are the flight tracks that we have filed that the pilots can fly. And along those flight tracks, they could go back and forth as much as they want. So if they're in a really good situation with liquid water content and temperatures, they could stick in that area, go back and forth, and fire as many flares as they want. That plane operates out of Logan. And then to the south is the Southern Utah aerial program, and that operates out of St. George. And again, you can see the flight tracks down there. And again, they're able to go back and forth along those tracks. Here's some examples from the app called FlightAware. So if you're ever thinking that we're the ones doing the chemtrails, you can look at FlightAware and see it's not us. We fly in cloud. So any of the trails you see in the sky, clear skies, that is definitely not us. But it's really good to be able to watch the operations occur in real time, and you get radar data overlaid it. Most of the operations are taking place anywhere from about 13,000 feet to 14,000 feet in altitude. So just being able to watch that has been a good experience, and we're going to refine a lot of the aerial program. It's only this was only the second year for St. George, only the first year for Logan. So there's still some work to do with the aerial programs. So of course, what do you get out of this? And that's the hardest question to answer in cloud seeding, because natural variability is a big deal. However, the contractors at North American Weather Consultants, they do a great job of doing a target and control evaluation. And this is a long-term target and control evaluation. And in order for one of their control areas to be matched with one of their target areas, they have to have a correlation of 0.9. So it's actually a pretty high correlation. And over that long-term period, we're seeing about a 6 to 11% increase in precipitation. And that equates to about 200,000 acre-feet of additional stream flow. About 55 to 60,000 acre-feet of that is happening within the GSL Basin. The benefit cost analysis, if you look at an acre-foot of water being worth about $100, that's probably a gross underestimate. That's about a $20 million return in just stream flow alone. And if you say we're about 50% off, then we're still seeing about $10 million in economic return. So this is some of the cheapest water you can get outside of conservation. We are planning to do a modeling study to look at some of these target and control methods, make sure that what the contractors are giving us lines up with the models. So we're excited about doing that here soon. So the short-term strategy for Utah is to continue that expansion of the remote generators. The Utah Climate Center is doing a feasibility study. They'll be wrapped up with that here in the next couple of weeks, where we're looking at the feasibility of the Ogden and Provo areas to start expanding target areas there. We want to review the aerial programs, find out what challenges we had and how we could possibly overcome those. I've already talked about the radiometer purchase, but then also the environmental study. We want to do that environmental work that I showed earlier here in Utah and make sure that the numbers align with what is going on in other states. For the long term, we want to look at creating a cloud seeding research advisory committee to make sure that the money the legislature has provided is being used wisely. We want to look at different feasibility studies, not just in the winter, but also a potential convective study. We're looking at new and different seeding agents, although silver iodide is king right now. And then a multi-year research campaign where we're looking at better targeting and dosaging practices, exactly where to put these generators, and of course the evaluations of the programs. That is all I have today, but I am open for questions. I'll stick around after. And I'll certainly entertain questions. Thank you.
We have 5 whole minutes for your burning cloud seeding questions.
I'm not this tall. I noticed a lot of the contractors, so the lower Colorado Basin.
Hello.
So the lower Colorado Basin contractors, let's say they're donating their money to DWQ. Does DWR, do they determine where the money goes?
With the lower Colorado River Basin states, there's a technical committee for the cloud seeding programs, and we give a proposal, and then, yeah, we determine where that money goes. But it's
Okay.
for the it's only for the lower Colorado
So
River
you're
Basin.
targeting anything that
Yeah,
feeds
just
into
the basin,
Colorado.
yeah, for the
Okay.
Colorado River.
I was curious. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe a little bit in the similar vein. Are there any issues now, or do you foresee in the future of Colorado saying you're stealing water that should be coming to us?
That is the one slide I forgot in here. So good, I have some time to cover that. So when you take a super cool liquid water droplet and you turn it into ice, it releases heat into the cloud. So think about a hot air balloon. When you put more heat into a hot air balloon, it's going to expand vertically, horizontally, and it's going to last longer as it goes down. So we actually have extra benefits from cloud seeding that occur downwind of our target areas. And when you look at the efficiency of, say, a normal thunderstorm, you're only working at about 19% efficiency. And Texas did a study that showed only 1% of the moisture is precipitating out of the skies as all that moisture goes over the state. So we're just tapping into a little bit of that moisture. So in fact, the extra area benefits, we are paying Peter and we are paying Paul at the same time. There is plenty of moisture available for everyone.
You had a slide that indicated ceasing operation based on excessive accumulation of snow. Does that mean in a particular area, if someone wanted to go up and seed the clouds, there's plenty of snow there already? And so to the detriment of, external impacts, you aren't going to work that area?
Yeah, and that's why we have that seeding suspension criteria for the 95th percentile for stream runoff. We're not so concerned about the snowpack. We're concerned about the melting of the snow. But with the issues, we have a little bit more of an aggressive take. And we defer to leadership on some of that stuff. So this year, we were a little bit more aggressive than usual. One more. I'll take one more.
I didn't walk fast. This is just a technical question. What's the average time lapse between ignition and precipitation?
Well, so to be clear, this is precipitation enhancement.
Right.
So precipitation usually is already ongoing. We're just trying to squeeze that sponge a little bit more. But most studies have shown about a 15-minute delay before we start to see that unnatural spike in precipitation flux that we're looking at. So about 15 minutes.
Thanks.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, the party's over. We'll see you tomorrow, and thank you all for being here. Have a good evening, and yeah, you rock. Thanks.